Now this is part 2 of a 2-part series where we show you how to rebuild the rear shock. Now if you need help with rebuilding the front shock, check out part 1 of this series. First thing we're going to want to do is take and place the top side of our shock body into our vise. Alright, so once we have our shock placed into our vise, we're going to take our tape measure and we'll measure our preload. So once you have that measurement, go ahead and write it down. Okay, so we want to back our preload adjuster up out of the way so that we have enough room to pull off our springs retainer. Before we pull off the retainer, we're going to take a flathead screwdriver here. Be careful not to damage the bump stop or the shock shaft. We want to bring the bump stop up out of the way so we have clearance for springs retainer to be removed. So once we have these things off and out of the way, we're going to take our shock, place it upright in our vise, and then we're going to take these cool little 4.5 inch bands that we got from the hardware store. You might be out $5 for these, but this will help us secure our reservoir to our shock body, make it a lot easier to work on. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is pull off our Schrader cap here. We'll depress the Schrader valve. We're going to take our Schrader valve tool, and we're just going to remove that Schrader just to ensure that we have all of the pressure relieved. And to double check, we're just going to push on the reservoir cap here to make sure we have all of our pressure relieved. So for the next part, we'll need our snap ring pliers. Okay, so now that we've got our reservoir seal cap removed, we're going to bust loose the seal head here. Now it's a good idea to have some rags handy. This does get pretty messy. We can pull this assembly out of the vise and we're going to empty the excess oil into our drain pan. Now while we're right here, we're going to take and back off our compression adjuster so that it's in a full soft position. So you can count the number of clicks from where you're at to go full out. We're at 14 clicks in from full out. So we'll write that down. Then we can take our IFP valve tool. This we can take and place inside of our reservoir. We'll locate our IFP, thread it on, then we can pull out the IFP. So now we're going to pull out the shock body assembly. We're going to take it back over to our drain pan and drain out the remaining shock oil. Then we're going to take our shock's shaft. And this is where we're going to gain access to our seal head. Now in order to do so, we have to remove our valving stack that we've got right here. So we're going to take our 11/16 socket with ratchet. We're going to get this nut removed. Now this is where a pick tool is going to come in handy so that we can keep track of the entire assembly. So when we go to put it back together, we don't get it wrong. Then we've got a spacer. Next we can pull off our seal head. Now for the seal head here, the first one that we have in the way is our wiper. We're going to want to pull this guy. And then just beneath that, we're going to have our next seal. And just beneath that seal, we have an O-ring to remove as well. So once we have those pulled off, we're going to want to give this a nice good cleaning with some contact cleaner. Also, we've got 2 O-rings that sit on the outer diameter. Pull these off while we're here as well. Give it a good inspection. You do have a Teflon guide band that's right here. If that is damaged, you will need to pull that out and get it replaced. Once this checks out, we're ready to install our new seals. So we've got our new O-ring here, our new wiper, and our new oil seal. So for this, we're going to start with our O-ring. All right, then we're going to move on to installing our oil seal. And then our last one's going to be our wiper. Now between the oil seal and the wiper, there is a difference. The wiper is a lot more stiffer than the oil seal. The oil seal is going to be a lot softer. Okay, so now that we've got our wiper in place, we need to replace these other 2 O-rings. Now we're ready to get it installed onto our shock shaft. But before we do that, we need to give this a good inspection and make sure that we don't have any nicks or dings or anything that could compromise our new seals. It looks like we're in pretty good shape. Now to get this installed, we're going to want to use the seal bullet. Place it onto our shaft like so. Just place some shock fluid on there just so we can keep it nice and lubed. And we'll take our seal head. Remember, this is going to be the bottom side. We'll place it onto the seal bullet. Okay, we can pull this off. Then we've got our spacer and our valving. May take a little bit of work to get all the shims placed back on. Now we're going to torque this nut in here to 32 foot-pounds. Now we can begin to add some shock oil. Now I'm going to bring our shock oil up to about this height on our reservoir, and it will equalize to the other side, so just be aware of that. Okay, next we're going to take our IFP here. We'll take our 3/32 Allen wrench. We'll need to remove the IFP bleed screw. Now before we get this installed, we're going to go ahead and replace the O-ring here. Make sure to give your wear bands a good inspection as well. We've got a wear band on our valving assembly here and as well as on the IFP. So now that we've got our O-ring replaced, we can take and place our IFP into our shock reservoir. So this is why we want to bring our fluid up to this height. We're going to press our IFP valve until it's submerged underneath our shock fluid, and we're going to see some air bubbles that come up through it. So once we've got it submerged, maybe 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch below the fluid, then we can install our IFP bleed screw. So then we can take our bleed screw, get it reinstalled, our IFP tool, thread it into place. Then we're going to set it to the bottom of our reservoir. This is going to push all this fluid through the reservoir's hose into the shock body, and any air that may be trapped inside of this distance here, we should be able to purge and push through to the other side. So once we've bottomed it out, we're going to bring it up slightly, then we'll cycle it 1 inch in distance approximately, just to make sure that we have any and all the air removed. So now I'm going to bring my IFP till it's about 2 inches from the top of the reservoir here. I'm going to pull out my IFP tool, fill this up with shock fluid till it's just below the threads on our shock body. So now we've got enough shock oil inside of our body here. We're going to take our shock shaft with valving assembly, and we're going to set it into the shock body. Now again, you're going to lose some more shock oil. Now we want to make sure that those bleed holes that were on the spacer are submerged in shock oil. And same thing we did on the front shock, we're going to strike the eyelet here so that we can purge any air that might be trapped inside of the valving's shim stack. See those air bubbles come out? Now from here, I'm just going to send it through its stroke for about 1 inch of travel. I want to bring the shock shaft up until there's about 1/4 of an inch of shock oil just above the bottom of that spacer. So with our spacer sitting about 1/4 inch below our shock fluid, we're going to take some shock oil, we're just going to top it off, and then we're going to bring the seal head down so that it can greet that spacer that's submerged. Now once we've got the seal head starting into the oil, we want to make sure that our shock is pulled up against our seal head. We want to make sure we've got all that air purged out of there. And we can start threading the seal head onto the shock body. Now Polaris doesn't give us a torque spec for this, so we're just going to snug it down. All right, so once we've got that taken care of, we need to move on to setting our IFP's depth. That's setting the depth of that internal floating piston. So for this particular machine, we're going to set it to 6.25 inches in depth. We'll need to remove the IFP's bleed screw. So now we can push on our IFP. Now in order to get that IFP to the depth that I need, I'm going to have to use some tools of sorts so that we can press it in there. Okay, so it looks like we're sitting right there at our 6.250 inches. Now the next part, we need to be able to get our IFP bleed screw back into the IFP itself. Now to do that, you need either a really long Allen wrench or this. So what I've come up with is our 1/4 inch drive extension, 1/4 inch socket here. Then I'm going to take some grease. I'm going to take and place a dab inside of the socket. Then I'm going to take my drill bit adapter. I'm going to place it inside like so, and this is going to create like a vacuum seal so that we don't drop this assembly when it's sitting inside of there. And then I'm going to take the IFP bleed screw and I'm going to feel it up with some grease. Then I can take my 3/32 Allen tool, bit rather, and seat it inside of there. So what this is going to do is create a nice vacuum seal so that I won't lose this assembly. We can take this over to our reservoir. Now for torque on this thing, again, Polaris doesn't give us a torque spec, so make sure it's nice and snug. All right, so once we have our IFP bleed screw in place, we can take our shock assembly out of the vise and we're going to dump out the excess shock oil that's inside of our reservoir. Once you've emptied out the reservoir of the excess oil, we'll mount it back up into our vise. Then we can take the reservoir's cap and get it ready to be placed back onto the reservoir. So again, here we have another O-ring. We're going to pull this off, spray it down with some contact cleaner, We can take our new O-ring here, get it lubed up, then we can take the reservoir's cap, place our new O-ring on, then we're ready to get this installed. Now it may be a little bit difficult to get it set in there initially, so just be careful with it, try to apply even pressure. And we want the seal cap to sit just beyond the ring landing for the snap ring. Then we can reinstall our snap ring. Once we've got that set, we can take our Schrader's valve, place back into the Schrader valve stem. So from here, we're gonna take this out of our vise, take it over to our nitrogen charger, and charge it up with 125 PSI. Okay, so we just got our shock charged with nitrogen at 125 PSI. Now, just to make sure we did everything correctly, we don't have any air bubbles in there, we're gonna compress the shock shaft, make sure it's a good, nice fluid motion. We don't hear any grinding or anything like that inside of there. And also, if there's any air bubbles, you will fill them. And it should rebound on its own. Perfect, just like that. Looks like we're in good shape. Now at this point, I'm gonna take and set this back to our original settings. We can pull off our band. All right, now we're ready for some springs. So we've gone ahead and cleaned up our threads a little bit here. We've wiped everything down. And before we get started, we're gonna take some lube here, get our threads lubricated. Then we can install our top spring, our spring divider, long side's gonna face down, and then our main spring. Then we can install our springs retainer, just like that. Then we can set our spring preload adjuster nut back to our original setting, which was 6 3/4 inches of preload. Now before we get too much tension on these springs, we do need to index some things to make sure everything's in its right spot. Now down here at the bottom on our spring retainer, we've got this opening. We want to make sure that this spring coil end is 180 degrees away from this opening here. So when you're setting the indexing of everything, it's good places to start at the bottom here. Now on our machine, we've got some aftermarket trailing arms. So when we go to mount the mudguard on here, ours is going to be facing the back side of the machine. Now if you don't have aftermarket trailing arms, you'll want your mudguard to be facing the front side of the shock. Okay, so once we've got that indexed, at our spring divider, we have arrows on both sides of it. So we want one arrow to be set at the top part of the spring where the spring's coil ends, as you can see here. And then for our tender spring, same thing on the other side. So we'll take where our spring's opening is, or spring coil end, and we'll set it to the other arrow on the other side of the spring divider. And that helps us make sure that when our springs are compressed, everything's nice and square. Okay, so it looks like we're back to 6 3/4 inches of spring preload. Last thing to do is set our bump stop. Now from here, the last thing we need to do is put on our mud guard. Okay, and that's it. It seems like a lot of work to do, but it's really not too bad. It does get a little messy, but with some time, the right tools, and some know-how, this is definitely something that you can tackle at home in your garage. Now you can find lots of OEM parts, tons of other parts, apparel, and accessory on our website at RockyMountainATVMC.com. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel and subscribe for more how-to videos. That's it for me, guys. I'm Dustin with Rocky Mountain. Thank you so much for watching, and keep turning those wrenches.